Okay, I think I'm live. And can I see myself? Yep, I'm there. Okay, what I'm doing, for anybody that comes on, I'm going to be reading, which I started in my last video a couple of days ago, was chapter 11 of Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. And all my pages are falling out there, you can see that. So I hope everybody, whoever's watching, can hear. I'm going to continue this because I think that grieving is quite an important point to healing childhood wounds and trauma that we've been through. So I'm going to read a little bit that I've got here and also a bit of research I was doing earlier. So hopefully I can be heard. That would be good if somebody wants to let me know. If you can't hear me, then you'll let me know, no doubt. So basically, looking up on grief earlier, I was doing a bit more research on the internet, and grief is a multifaceted response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or something that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed, although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss. It also has a physical, cognitive, behavioral, and social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. So for people that have been through childhood trauma and abuse, there is a loss that often doesn't get grieved. So because it's just a normal way of, we believe that, you know, we don't even think, we're just children. So what happens is that we just grow through into our teenage years. And if we're going through abuse every day, be it sexual abuse, verbal abuse, or physical abuse, or spiritual abuse, we don't see it as meaning anything to us particularly, because that's just the way of life. And we just get on with life thinking that behavior is normal. It's when we get into our adulthood and we've got something called arrested development, where we're not fully formed because when we've not been able to stand up for ourselves or say no, or, you know, sort of have a fight about it and say, don't treat me that way. When we've been so mistreated, we have something called arrested development, which is an emotional thing where our emotions are not fully developed. So it can be in the matter of our own heart, in the matters of love, or in even what we believe about ourselves. So reading on, psychological trauma is damage to the mind that occurs as a result of a distressing event. Trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience. And this leads to disassociation in adulthood and in childhood as well, but it becomes more apparent as we get into our adulthood what disassociation is. Disassociation is one way the mind copes with too much stress, such as during a traumatic event. So for many people that have been through abuse in childhood, it would be during the event that we would have disassociated. There are many things I used to do, but one thing that I used to remember doing as a form of disassociation was I used to stand by the light switch, or I don't know what you'd call it in America, but there's the light switch in, and turn it on and off. And it's like where you become obsessive, compulsive about things in order to feel safe. And I was quite dreamlike as a child as well. I wasn't really in my body, because I think through, you know, sexual abuse or violence, what happens is that we switch off, and then we basically will live in a way where we're not really seen, but, or I remember myself, it was like almost I wasn't there. So it's interesting how when we look back on our childhoods, it's like I've got a huge chunk missing of my own childhood that I really can't recall. I remember the events, but I don't remember the, you know, any joy or any other things that happened. I remember the traumatic events more than any other events. I don't remember being picked up or held or loved. All I remember is abusive events. So then we've got disassociation is one way the mind copes with too much stress, such as during a traumatic event. The word disassociation can be used in different ways, but it usually describes an experience where you feel disconnected in some way from the world around you or from yourself. So then we grow into adults that disassociate. And, you know, in life, I think there's a healthy amount of disassociation, and then there's an unhealthy amount. And only we can know that by the way our lives are either working or not working. And if our lives are not working, and we're, you know, maybe we become loners or we're hypervigilant, then we're living out our childhood stuff and not living fully as we may like to do. We know where we struggle with ourselves. We're each individuals, so we're all affected individually differently. What I'm going to do is, I started reading chapter 11 of Pete Walker's book the other night, and I'm going to continue with a little bit more of that. He basically says that grieving the absence of parental care, part of the healing is going to be grieving the absence of the parental care and nurturing that we did not get. So as our capacity to grieve evolves, we typically uncover a great deal of unresolved grief around the deadening absence of nurturance. We needed to develop and thrive. So if we haven't had the nurturance, then we don't develop and we don't thrive. Here are the 4 key types of parental nurturing that all children need in order to flourish. So I'm going to read this list. This is what all children need in order to flourish, and then you can figure out whether you've had this or not. He says, knowing about these unmet needs can help you to grieve out the unreleased pain that comes from having grown up without the type of support. Moreover, this knowledge can guide you to reparent and interact with yourself more nurturingly, in a nurturing way. So we need to know that we, at some point, however hard it is that we're going to have to reparent ourselves and we're going to have to nurture ourselves. We can go and seek it from other people, but it's going to be short-lived. You know, we might have a friend we can call, or a lover, or a partner, or we might be married with somebody who we go to for our, you know, support. But ultimately, we're gonna have to build up ourselves so that we're nurturing ourselves, so that we're not codependent and relying to feel good, that feeling of feeling good, totally on another human being. So, number 1, verbal nurturance. Eager participation in multidimensional conversations, generate generous amounts of praise and positive feedback, willingness to entertain all questions, teaching, reading stories, providing resources for ongoing verbal development. So that is the job of a parent. That is a good enough parenting. There's no perfect parents in this world, but a good enough parent will, you know, give verbal nurturance. Number 2, spiritual nurturance. Seeing and reflecting back to the child his or her essential worth, basic goodness, and loving nature. And gendering experiences of joy and fun and love to maintain the child's innate sense that life is a gift. Spiritual or philosophical guidance to help the child integrate painful aspects of life, nurturing the child's creative self-expression and frequent exposure to nature. Again, that's what good enough parenting would be. Number 3, emotional nurturance, meeting the child consistently with caring regard and interest, welcoming and valuing the child's full emotional expression, modeling non-abusive expression of emotions, teaching safe ways to release anger that do not hurt the child or others, generous amounts of love, warmth, tenderness, and compassion, honoring tears as a way of releasing hurt and being a safe refuge and humor. Number 4, physical nurturance, affection and protection, healthy diet, healthy sleep schedule, teaching habits of grooming, discipline, and responsibility, and helping the child develop hobbies, outside interests, and own sense of personal style, helping the child's balance, rest, work, and play. Now, reading on, I'm going to keep reading here. I've got 1 viewer at the moment, but I'm happy with that. It says, he says here, my book, The Doubt of Fully Feeling, that's another book he's written, contains extensive guidelines and encouragements for identifying and grieving the losses of childhood. He says Sandra Bloom's article, The Grief That Dare Not Speak Its Name, Part 2, Dealing with the Ravages of Childhood, also identifies childhood losses from trauma in a very specific and compelling way. So he gives a website here, which I'll put that below the link of below the videos. So it's www.sanctuaryweb.com. I haven't looked at that, but I will look and add it to my list below. Below this video, you're going to have 14 steps for managing your inner, or for dealing with your inner critic, which is something that has to go as we're dealing with healing ourselves. We have to get rid of our inner critic that tells us that we're not good enough. And the other thing we have to do is understand what flashbacks are and how to deal with those. So there's 13 steps that you will find below this video also for dealing with flashbacks, which is a flashback is when you get triggered. An emotional flashback is when you get triggered by something that you've seen or something that you've heard or something that's going on, and it will give you the, the feeling that you're back in that trauma. It could be the tone of somebody's voice, it could be something you've seen on the news, or it could be, that you'll feel that you're going to be abandoned. There are many ways that we can go into emotional flashbacks, but we can begin to deal with them and heal that part of ourselves as well. I've been quite successful at dealing with flashbacks. When I used to get them, they'd last for days and hours, and now I can have a flashback and be in it for about half an hour, but then I know what I need to do to resolve. I need to know that I'm in a flashback, so I say that to myself, and then I get to, verbally ventilate. I'll call a friend that's available to me and understands me, so that I'm able to say, I'm having a flashback and I feel really bad right now and I need your help. So we are able to guide ourselves out of having flashbacks as well. And the list is below this video. Continuing reading, he says, it is often difficult to become motivated to grieve losses that occurred so long ago. Many of these losses seem so nebulous that trying to embrace grieving is a bit like trying to embrace dental work. Who wants to go to the dentist? Big question. But who doesn't want to go to get, when the toothache becomes acute. So when we get a toothache, we know we've got to go to the dentist, and generally people will avoid it until such a time that we have to go. But generally that's the same with grieving our childhood losses. We might put it off and be in disassociation and sort of, sweep it away from us when we really know that we need to look at it at some point. He says here, soul ache is considerably harder to assign to the losses of childhood, yet those who take the grieving journey described below come to know unquestionably that the core of their soul ache, that means the soul aching, and psychological suffering is in the unworked through losses of growing up with abandoning parents. So if we've been abandoned as children, we can go around, either with depression, feeling not good enough, feeling sad about ourselves, looking outside ourselves, for a fix, whether it be from a relationship or thinking that we need love outside ourselves. And eventually what we've got to do when we begin the grieving process, however scary it is, we will begin to nurture self, which means we stop looking outside ourselves for somebody to make us feel okay. And that's a very defining point in healing, when we know that we are able as adults to take care of ourselves, and that when we need other people, that we're not afraid to put our hand up and say, I need help. Reading on, he says, these losses have to be grieved until the person really gets how much her or his caretakers were not caretakers, and how much her parents were not her allies. She needs to grieve she or he needs to grieve until she stops blaming herself for their abuse or neglect. She needs to grieve until she fully realizes that their abysmal parenting practices gave her that awful gift that keeps on giving, CPTSD. So CPTSD, if you're listening out there, is it's similar to PTSD, but the difference is that CPTSD has been created by ongoing events time and time again. We'll find this in situations where, even in adult situations where there's maybe violent abuse in relationship or verbal abuse that can happen. It doesn't just happen with children. People can get CPTSD. We can find it in places where there's been wars, where people have been incarcerated, and also currently with what's going on with human trafficking, where people are being trafficked, young children and young women and boys as well, and people generally where there's ongoing daily form of abuse or fear, it becomes CPTSD, so it becomes complex. And that's the difference. A PTSD event is generally a one-off event, and that's not making PTSD any smaller, it's just making people aware of the difference. He says here, she needs to grieve, or he or she needs to grieve until she understands how her learned habit of automatic self-abandonment is a reenactment of their abject failure to be there for her. So what happens is that if we've been through abandonment and loss and betrayal as a child, very small and growing up into our teenage years, then we do something that's called repetition compulsion, which means that we abandon ourselves. And clearly we're not doing that on purpose. It's a learnt behavior. And that will mean that we make choices and choose people that will also abandon us. And when they do, it's like, well, say, well, you know, my parents were right, you know, I'm worthless. So it's like repetition compulsion. The whole point really with the repetition compulsion is that when we get to see it for what it is, why we keep having the same events that appear to occur over and over again, whatever area of life it's in for us. It could be, you know, with our finances, it could be with relationships, it could be with jobs that we get into where people are abusive to us. We can see that we do eventually have some control, but we're going to have to grieve and absolutely put the blame where it should be put. So this is healthy blame. It's not, you know, where we're going around pointing the finger and unhealthy blame. It's healthy blame, which is very needed in childhood trauma, because without blame, healthy blame, we're not able to grieve the reality of what occurred in childhood. And some people have had a very heinous, traumatic time. Going on, I've got 2 people watching, so thanks for being there, whoever it is. Reading on, he says, mourning these awful realities empowers our efforts to develop a multi-dimensional practice of self-care. As we grieve more effectively, our capacities for self-compassion and self-protection grow, and our psyche becomes increasingly user-friendly. And I can tell you that's the absolute truth, that what I found is that my self-compassion is huge, and my self-protection has grown, and that my psyche has become user-friendly to me. Like I might have a moment of feeling sad or sorry for myself, but then I'm able to snap out of it. And, you know, I can have humor about healing as well, you know, that I can be in tears, and then I could, you know, 5 minutes later I can be laughing and realizing that I am okay now. So reading on, so he says grieving flashbacks, it helps to, it's like a balm. Okay, so when we grieve, it's like a soothing balm to healing. He says pain is excess energy crying out for release. And he said, Gerald Hurd said that. He says, grieving sometimes seems sacramental to me in its ability to move me out of the abandonment melange, that extremely painful and upsetting, you know, it's upsetting, and lots of fear, shame and depression that is at the emotional core of most flashbacks. So flashbacks, generally we've got shame, we've got fear, we've got depression. He says a survivor can learn to grieve himself out of fear, the death of feeling safe. He can learn to grieve himself out of shame, the death of feeling worthy. He can learn to grieve himself out of depression, the death of feeling fully alive. With sufficient grieving, the survivor gets what he was, innocent and eminently lovable as a child. So when we look at all children are lovable and all children are innocent. There is absolute no doubt about that, every single child. As he mourns the bad luck of not being born to loving parents, he finds within himself a fierce, unshakable self-allegiance. He becomes ready, willing, and able to be there for himself, no matter what he is experiencing internally or externally. So the beauty of this is that the more knowledge that we have, the more we get to know that we can be there for ourselves, even when we're feeling really crappy about life. You know, we've got a way of being able to manage ourselves. Reading on, he says, grief work also releases you from the impatience and frustration that can arise when you get re-stuck in an inner critic attack. This is especially important during those monster flashbacks when the critic can bully you into wanting to give up. So your inner critic can, you know, you might be trying to heal something, and then your inner critic will step in and say, why aren't you over that yet? It happened such a long time ago. What's wrong with you, you idiot? So your inner critic is a voice that isn't your voice, that's a voice that was given to you. You know, for instance, if you were crying as a child after you got beaten, or, you know, if you were sexually abused and then you were just, you know, told to get on with the rest of the day, you weren't allowed to feel your feelings. So you know, the inner critic will hammer you and tell you that you're, you know, that you're not allowed to feel these things, that you just got to get on with it. What's wrong with you? And this is why the inner critic work is really, really important in healing CPTSD. The inner critic is not our own voice. It's a voice that was given. And, you know, I'm questionable. To me, God is like source. It's something that I don't, you know, I can't picture, but God is something that makes me feel safe. God to me is like it's a higher power that I feel a connection with. And I know that I'm loved by God, and that really helps me. So that's not a religious aspect, or even, I wouldn't even call it a spiritual aspect. It's like a numinous aspect of, for instance, like if you in the summertime recently, I take pictures of flowers, and, you know, as I've been going around walking, you know, walking around the streets, and not walking around the streets, but as I've been out and about taking pictures of flowers. And sometimes when I see the most beautiful flower, I see God in that, like the numinous of the beauty, like angelic stuff in the most beautiful flowers that surround us on planet Earth. And when I remind myself that I've got God, or I've got, you know, that God loves me, or that I'm protected by angels, for instance, that really, really helps me. I do that at night. I call in my angels, and that's what works for me. And it really depends on whatever we believe in. But, you know, I don't think we're alone. We can feel very lonely in this world sometimes. You know, we might want to speak to somebody and they might not be available to us. We might, you know, feel that we need a relationship to make us feel better. We might think we need more money, or, you know, different circumstances, when generally a lot of the things can be put right when we begin to nurture our inner world, and we begin to get rid of the inner critic and tell it to go away. And the more we do it, the less it will play a part in our lives, which is really good thing to know about the inner critic. And what I found, the more I dealt with my inner critic, or when I began to look at, you know, deal with my inner critic, the more I realized just how powerful this voice, or that I was giving it, not that I was giving it, but it was really causing me a lot of problems. And even people that have not been through abuse have an inner critic that hammers them. So it's that much harder for people that have been through abuse, if we can see there. Reading on. Inner critic hindrances to grieving. The greatest hindrance to effective grieving is typically the inner critic. When the critic is especially toxic, grieving may be counterproductive and contradicted in early recovery. Those who were repeatedly pathologized and punished for emoting in childhood may experience grieving as exasperating their flashbacks rather than relieving them. I have worked with numerous survivors whose tears, he says the tears, immediately triggered them into toxic shame. So I can say for myself, I know that when I started doing therapy, or sometimes in my early days of helping myself, if I started crying, I would immediately say sorry. For instance, so I might be with somebody, or I'd apologize for crying. And we can see that really that's toxic shame. Like, tears cannot be helped. That, you know, that when we cry, it's like laughter. When we laugh, we can't stop ourselves laughing. It's just, when laughter comes, it comes, and it just comes out of us. And tears are exactly the same. When tears come, it's a natural expression. And the same for children, you know, when they giggle, or when they're having laughter, or when they're crying, you know, it's not something that we can force. You know, for people to force themselves to cry or laugh, they'd have to be extremely good actors or actresses. So he says, I have worked with numerous survivors whose tears immediately triggered them into toxic shame. Their own potentially soothing tears elicited terrible self-attacks. I'm so pathetic. No wonder nobody can stand me. God, I am so unlovable. When I snivel like this, I F up and then make myself more of a loser by whining about it. What good is crying for yourself? It only makes you weaker. This latter response is particularly ironic, for once grieving is protected from the critic, nothing can restore a person's inner strength and coping capacity like a good cry. I have diffused active suicidality, he says, on dozens of occasions by simply eliciting the suffering person's tears. So often when we feel like we want it all to be over and we've had enough and we don't want to be here anymore, we all go through, you know, maybe thinking that sometimes, that those feelings can be eliminated through having a good cry. You know, sometimes we just need to sob, and sometimes things will make us cry. For instance, I was watching something, I'm not a particular fan, but I was watching some history on Celine Dion the other night on YouTube, and looking at her life, because I study evolutionary astrology, and I was looking at her natal chart to understand her psyche. And the interesting thing is that, you know, she had a really hard time where her husband died of cancer. She had 3 people who died of, you know, cancer over a very short period of time. And when I saw, you know, what she'd had to go through, it really it brought out these tears in me that were really, really big tears, like the depth of grief. So sometimes we might see something that might make us cry, but it will touch into our own grieving and our own pain of loss. So going on, he says, angering can also immediately trigger the survivor into toxic shame. This is often true of instances when there is only an angry thought or fantasy. Dysfunctional parents typically reserve their worst punishments for their child's anger. This then traps the child's anger inside. So if you can imagine, if you've been through abuse, verbal, you know, sexual, physical, spiritual, and you want to, you know, you sort of get angry in that moment with a parent, and you're small and you get angry, which is a natural response to being abused. I know that if somebody, you know, generally abuses us as adults, we do get angry. It's a natural response. If a child is shut down and they're not allowed to feel their anger, it's giving them really mixed messages. It's like saying, you know, you have to accept this abuse. It's your fault. You're worthless. And if you feel angry, then there's something wrong with you for feeling angry, which is, you know, we can just see how, you know, these things can really hurt people and and then they play out in our adult lives as well. Going on, he says, critic management is often the primary work of early stage grief work. The work involves recognizing and challenging the ways the critic is blocking or shaming the process of grieving. So the inner critic will block or shame us into feeling angry. And sometimes, unfortunately, and I've seen this on social media many times, myself being part of spiritual groups over the years, which I'm not so much now, that if you express your anger or your upset towards parents or carers that abused you, people will say things like, oh, you've got to forgive them, they're your parents. And I have to say, there is no got to do anything for anything. The most important thing is that we've got to realize is that each soul is unique, that even if somebody has a child, that child is not owned by the people that had the child. Like, you know, we've all got to come through planet Earth. We've all got to have a parent. So parents are either going to be good enough parents, or they're going to be parents that are not conscious, and therefore it's going to give us loads of problems, which happens, you know, 1 in 3 boys and 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys have had sexual abuse, verbal abuse and violence in childhood. And that's from Pete Walker's book, From Surviving to Thriving. And there's 7.5 billion of us. So we have to realize this is a lot of people that have been through trauma. So let me go back to this. Critic management. So we've got to manage that inner critic, and the inner critic list is below 14 inner critic attacks that we need to understand, so we can stop having conversations with this inner critic. He says this work involves recognizing and challenging the ways the critic is blocking or shaming the process of grieving. As disidentification from the critic increases, grieving can then best be initiated with low intensity verbal ventilation. So verbal ventilation is really important. And the other thing is that many who've been through abuse have been told that you know, don't tell anybody anything. That's what I was told as a child. Don't tell anybody anything. Clearly we've got to, you know, earn people's trust. We don't want people that are going to use our own abuse against us. So, you know, get to know people. And if you do it in like-minded groups on Facebook, I have a ladies group, for instance, that's very safe, where people can, you know, feel safe to talk to each other and be true to each other as well. You know, it's a beautiful group of ladies. I don't know if there are any groups for men out there with CPTSD, but no doubt there may be, and it's worth looking. I know of a couple of healing groups though on CPTSD, but they're mixed groups. He says, over time, verbal ventilation can be allowed to gradually increase in sad and angry intonation. So it's okay to be sad, and you know, we don't have to pretend when we're not sad, and we don't have to pretend that we're not angry when we're angry. Like to say, I'm really angry that that happened to me. Just verbally ventilating that can help us. And if we've got a good friend or a therapist or somebody that's going to hear that, it's going to help us, you know, somebody that's going to be there for us and hold our hand and say, yeah, that was really crap that that happened to you. And going on, he says, once the inner critic has been sufficiently diminished and once thought correction techniques have made the psyche more user-friendly, a person begins to tap into grief's sweet relief, granting potential. So eventually grieving will bring us to, you know, it will bring us relief, because if nobody cried for us as a child, then we need to cry for that inner child that really, really suffered, and form a bond with our own inner child and reparent our own inner child and begin caring for our own inner child as well, and loving that child and giving that child what it never had as adults. He says here, he learns to grieve in a way that promotes and enhances, 220, enhances compassion for the abandoned child he was and for the survivor he is today. So, you know, I just look at the magnificence in myself, like all I've been through and how I've turned out. And we need to get really grateful for who we are as well, and realize that we're not going around abusing people, and that we are full of love, and that we might have work to do on ourselves, but we're not alone. Everybody on this planet has work to do on themselves. So, and also to realize that we can still be suffering with the throes of painful flashbacks and know what to do when that happens. Reading on, defueling the critic through grieving. He says, fear drives the toxic inner critic. The critic feeds off fear and flashes the survivor back into the frightening times of childhood. She gets stuck seeing herself only through her parents' contemptuous, intimidating, or rejecting eyes. So some of you might recall how you were looked at as a child by adults. They might have been really disdainful to you with their eyes or with their tone. And you know, we can re-experience that as an adult, like somebody might use a tone on us and then it'll flash us back into our memories, and then we don't feel safe, we feel afraid, we want to run instead of saying, hey, don't speak to me like that, you know. And the beautiful thing is, the more we understand this stuff, the more we start standing up for ourselves in a, I'd say for me, like in an elegant way. And I've been able to, you know, stand up for myself, stand my ground and say what I need to say. And it's been very tricky because, you know, when I first started, it's like I didn't want to feel like I was going to be abandoned by anybody, and that would stop me speaking up. But I've got braver and braver. The more decent people that I've met as I've moved through my own healing, the more I've been safer to say, because when you've got a decent human being in front of you and you tell them you don't like something and you're being fair about what you don't like, or it's a preference of yours, they will listen to you. Somebody who respects you and cares about you going to listen to you. And, you know, and then also we get to compromise with each other as well. Like if we don't agree on something, we don't have to, like, you know, run away and hide. We can begin to speak about our issues with each other and have a bit of healthy confrontation. And the beautiful thing with healthy confrontation, where it's respectful, means that the two people in that confrontation grow and evolve, and then the friendship or whatever becomes something else. It forms, you know, you begin to get a closer bond. So let's see. She gets stuck seeing herself only through her parents' contemptuous, intimidating, or rejecting eyes. She then imitates them and scornfully mocks herself as defective, ugly, unlovable, and she scares herself with endangerment scenarios and abhors herself for insignificant imperfections. You know, the thing is, we've all got imperfections. Every single one of us, you know, we can get up you know, close in a mirror and look at ourselves, every single one of us has got perfections, imperfections, and perfections. Every single one of us has something beautiful about us. And every single one of us has, you know, issues somewhere. You know, it's however things appear when we're looking outside in the world, how people maybe have got it together, particularly on our lovely social media with profile pictures and, you know, people's lives. We can think people have got it stuff resolved and sorted, and this is not the case. Everybody's got things that we don't know about that are going on in their lives. So then he says, because fear is a core emotional experience, emotional tools are needed to manage the fright that runs haywire during a flashback. Healthy angering and crying can short circuit fear from morphing into the flashback, triggering cognitions of the critic. I have seen grieving bring the critic's devastating programs of drasticizing and catastrophizing to a screeching halt on thousands of occasions. It appears that children are hardwired to release fear through angering and crying. So you can see when a little child gets scared, or, you know, they think their mummy's going away from them or something, they'll start crying, and we're hardwired and for that. So when we're stopped crying in childhood or being angry, you know, that, you know, mummy's going to work, or we're gonna, you know, we're not going to get what we want, we're not going to get our ice cream or whatever, you know, or something's going to be taken away from us. This is normal. So when we've been stopped in childhood, it really causes arrested development. It says the newborn baby mourning the death of living safely and fully contained inside the mother's womb utters the first of many angry cries, not only to call for nurturance and attention, but also to release her fear or his fear. So that's the first thing. When we come into this world, we cry, and that's because the safety that we were in the womb has, you know, been removed. So it's very fascinating to think that that's the first thing we do when we come into the world, we cry. In the dysfunctional family, however, the traumatizing parent soon eradicates the child's capacity to emote. So if we're not allowed to emote, if we're not allowed to feel and we're not allowed to express our feelings, then we have arrested development. The child becomes afraid and ashamed of her own tears and anger. Tears get shut off and anger gets trapped inside and is eventually turned against the self as self-attack. Self-hate, self-disgust, and self-rejection. Self-hate is the most grievous reenactment of parental abandonment. So we need to realize that when we reject ourselves or we have self-hatred, then we're basically reenacting parental abandonment. And that's very useful knowledge to have, because if we understand that when we go into self-hate or self-disgust or self-rejection, that what all we're doing basically is reenacting the parental abandonment, we begin to objectify and we get to see, hey, that's what I was taught. I don't need to do that anymore. This is quite an important thing to maybe realize. He says, over time, anger also becomes fuel for the critic and actually exasperates fear by creating an increasingly dangerous internal environment. Anything the survivor says, thinks and feels, imagines or wishes for is subjected to an intimidating inner attack. Okay, 20, 21. 21, inner attack. Okay, page 22, I'm going to read 222. Sorry, this page is 222. He says, here are some common anger-powered critic attacks. They are presented in first-person voice, with which the critic inevitably acquires. So it means that a voice that we hear, it becomes first person. So we say, for instance, we might say to ourselves when we're dealing with our inner critic on our own, why did I ask such a stupid question? Could I have had an uglier expression on my face? Who am I kidding? How could an undeserving loser like me wish for love? No wonder I feel like, he says the S word there, I won't say it on YouTube, and it's basically demeaning to ourselves. He says recovery is enhanced immeasurably by co-opting this anger from the critic and using it for the work of distancing from and shrinking the inner critic. As we shall see below, as you become proficient at grieving, you will notice that your critic's volume and intensity ebbs dramatically. In fact, without the aid of effective grieving, progress in inner critic shrinking can only go so far. So let's see. Right, I've been on for 40 minutes, so I'm going to leave it there today. And then I'm going to come back tomorrow with something else. I've got another live coming on tomorrow night. So thank you for whoever's watched this with me. And I'll be back tomorrow. Just check out my YouTube channel and you'll see I'm on tomorrow night. I'm going to look at spiritual bypassing and maybe a little bit more of finishing off this chapter. I'll catch you tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Thank you.